Mark Carney asked, quite directly, why Canadian fertilizer still had to detour through US ports when a shorter, more cost-effective route to Europe already existed. He also questioned why Saskatchewan farmers were paying fees to American logistics corporations while a Canadian Arctic seaport sat idle. Those questions landed like a shock, because they exposed a reality that had quietly taken shape over many years. Control and profits from Canada's core agricultural sector were being steadily siphoned away. Canada grows wheat in Saskatchewan, produces canola in Alberta, and holds a leading position globally in potash. The country is the world's largest exporter of potash and the third largest exporter of wheat. Yet for decades, Canadian grain and fertilizer were forced southward first, dependent on US railways, storage facilities, and fee structures, before reaching global markets. When Donald Trump threatened tariffs of up to 25% on Canadian grain and intensified pressure on fertilizer exports, that dependence ceased to be a mere inconvenience and became a serious strategic risk. A glance at the map made clear that a major opportunity had been missed. The Port of Churchill, a deep-water Arctic gateway, can cut thousands of kilometers off shipping routes to Europe compared with transiting through Vancouver or US ports. After years of neglect and underinvestment, the port suddenly emerged as a key to freeing Canada from its old dependencies. What followed was not merely symbolic, but a structural shift with direct implications for nearly $780 billion in agricultural trade. So how did a long-forgotten Arctic port rise to become a critical pillar of Canada's new economic strategy? Why are fertilizer producers now increasingly bypassing the United States in their shipping routes? And what happens when American logistics firms lose control over North America's most important agricultural corridor? The true scale of Canada's agricultural economy is rarely fully recognized. Despite data showing the country ranks among the world's leading food powers, Canada does not sit on the margins of the global food supply chain. It stands at its very center. Potash alone makes this reality unmistakably clear. Canada produces and exports more potash than any other country, accounting for roughly 32% of global production and approximately 41% of total world exports, with an estimated 1.1 billion tons still remaining underground. Potash is a cornerstone of modern agriculture, and without it, global crop yields would decline sharply. Potash and nitrogen-based fertilizers currently support food production for nearly half of the world's population. That means Canada's mineral resources play a direct role in feeding billions of people, even though this connection is rarely acknowledged. Grain tells a similar story, though on a different scale, further underscoring Canada's pivotal position in global food security. Canada's wheat exports generate roughly $11.5 billion annually, with volumes of about 27.7 million tons shipped to more than 80 countries. The country holds a leading global position in high-quality, protein-rich wheat, precisely the type favored by markets where consistency and performance are paramount. When canola, barley, oats, lentils, peas, and a wide range of other specialized crops are added, the overall picture highlights Canada's critical role even more clearly. Domestic producers dominate numerous niche segments that are small in volume but vital to global food security. In 2023, the total value of Canada's agricultural exports surpassed $99 billion, with projected growth of approximately 3.5% per year. These are not theoretical figures. They represent real leverage in international trade, with tangible influence across food supply chains and measurable economic power. Yet despite this strong foundation, the routes by which Canadian agricultural products have reached global markets have long reflected dependence rather than autonomy. Most grain from Western Canada still moves through Vancouver, a port that routinely faces congestion, rising costs, and limited operational flexibility. When shipments do not head west, they move south instead, relying on US rail networks and ports before reaching international markets. Fertilizer from Saskatchewan follows a similar path, flowing through American logistics systems en route to global destinations. At each stage, costs accumulate. Rail freight charges, port fees, logistics services, and profit margins are layered on top of one another, with much of the value captured by US companies. These firms profit without planting a single seed or extracting a single ton of potash. Canadian farmers and producers have long recognized the inefficiencies of this model, but for many years, viable alternatives were virtually non-existent. Vancouver remained the only option capable of operating year-round at a scale sufficient to meet export demand. Eastbound routes via the St. Lawrence River extended transit times and added further complexity to the logistics chain. Arctic routes for many years existed largely on paper and were difficult to implement in practice. Gradually, this dependence came to be accepted as a given, simply because no clearly viable alternative seemed to exist. That way of thinking only truly broke down when political risk became impossible to ignore. When Donald Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, including the possibility of duties of up to 25% on grain and increased pressure on fertilizer exports, a much deeper vulnerability was immediately exposed. Infrastructure controlled by another country is never entirely neutral. What had once been regarded as a routine cost of doing business suddenly became a question of sovereignty. When the United States controls the logistics chain, it also holds the capacity to influence outcomes. This realization forced Ottawa to revisit an issue that had been sidelined for decades. At the center of that reassessment was a port that most Canadians had nearly forgotten. The Port of Churchill, built in the 1930s on the shores of Hudson Bay, was originally conceived as Canada's northern gateway to Europe. It was equipped with a rail connection, deep water access, and a geographic position capable of significantly shortening shipping distances. Compared with routing shipments through Vancouver or relying on U.S. ports, this corridor could have reshaped Canada's trade patterns. Reality, however, unfolded differently. Chronic underinvestment, seasonal operating constraints, and a lack of sustained political attention turned Churchill into an anomaly rather than a true economic pillar. By the early 2000s, traffic through the port had fallen so sharply that questions were openly raised about whether it still served any purpose at all. The decisive turn in this decline came in 1997, when the port and its roughly 1,300-kilometer rail line were sold to the U.S. private company Omnitrax for the symbolic price of $1. That price spoke volumes about how profoundly policymakers at the time underestimated the strategic value of this infrastructure. After the sale, investment capital all but dried up, and maintenance was neglected for years. When severe flooding in 2017 caused extensive damage to the rail line, Omnitrax failed to carry out the necessary repairs. The track quickly deteriorated to the point of becoming unusable. The Port of Churchill fell silent. The town of Churchill was effectively cut off. Many believed it marked the end, yet only a few years later, those assumptions began to unravel as the global landscape started to change. Shipping costs continued to rise. Congestion at major ports grew increasingly severe. Arctic shipping routes became viable for longer periods as a result of climate change. At the same time, prolonged uncertainty surrounding U.S. trade policy forced companies to look for alternatives. More importantly, the private sector began to recognize the clear economic logic behind options that had previously been set aside. A decisive signal emerged in March 2025 when Genesis Fertilizers, a Saskatchewan-based company preparing to build a large-scale nitrogen fertilizer plant, announced a partnership agreement with Arctic Gateway Group. Genesis laid out a plan designed to fundamentally break with the old model. Phosphate and ammonium sulfate would be imported directly through Churchill. Fertilizer products from Finland would also be exported along the same route, opening up a new logistics corridor, one that is more independent and more efficient for Canadian agriculture. In this scenario, U.S. infrastructure is largely bypassed altogether. Corporate leadership did not frame this as an ideological statement, but as a matter of autonomy through control. In a globalized economy, thinking must also be global, and moving fertilizer from Western Canada through Hudson Bay to Europe simply makes more sense and is more efficient than routing shipments through Vancouver or relying on U.S. ports. The numbers quickly reinforce that argument. Genesis expects to produce approximately 1 million tons of fertilizer per year, implying a need to import roughly 300,000 tons of phosphate. Previously, most of that volume entered Canada through American logistics systems. Under the new model, the point of entry would be Churchill. The shipping route from Saskatchewan to Europe via Hudson Bay is significantly shorter than detours through often congested West Coast ports or transit through the Panama Canal. Shorter distances translate into lower costs, faster delivery times, and reduced political risk. This is not a symbolic or nationalist narrative. It is about margins, stability, and long-term predictability. Once a company demonstrates that such a model works, its effects tend to spread quickly. Saskatchewan's fertilizer industry is worth billions of dollars annually. If Genesis succeeds in building a supply chain centered on the Port of Churchill, other firms are likely to follow. Fertilizer, however, is only the beginning. Grain is the sector with far greater scale. The Port of Vancouver alone handles nearly 29 million tons of Canadian grain each year. By contrast, volumes that once moved through Churchill were modest, typically only a few 100,000 tons in strong harvest years. The original objective was never to fully replace Vancouver's role. What Canada has been seeking is to unlock future trade opportunities that have long been constrained by infrastructure bottlenecks. From that perspective, the Churchill Plus Port Initiative gradually emerged as the central pillar of this strategy. The plan includes building new grain handling systems, expanding storage capacity, installing modern loading equipment, and upgrading rail transport capabilities. With the support of an icebreaker fleet, the shipping season could be extended well beyond the traditional 4-month window and over the longer term, may even approach near year-round operations. For European markets, the advantages are clear. Shipping grain through Churchill shortens transit times by roughly 6 days compared with routes through Vancouver. For traders and international buyers, that translates into lower logistics costs, reduced risk of spoilage, faster delivery, and greater reliability. At the same time, this route requires no involvement from the United States. Grain grown by Canadian farmers moves on Canadian railways, is loaded at a Canadian port, and is delivered directly to foreign customers. The associated fees remain within the country. Control rests entirely with Canada. This shift helps explain the frequently cited $780 billion figure. It does not represent the total value of Canada's agricultural sector, but rather an estimate of the volume of trade that could pass through Churchill over the next decade if the planned expansions are fully implemented. Saskatchewan's potash exports alone currently amount to roughly $5.5 billion per year. If just half of that volume were redirected northward over a 10-year period, the cumulative value would approach $27.5 billion. Add to that grain exports to Europe and selected Asian markets, where Churchill offers a more efficient shipping route. Conservative estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of current cargo volumes could be rerouted through Hudson Bay. That represents billions of dollars annually in wheat, canola, and specialty crops. This does not include flows of imported and exported fertilizer, critical minerals from northern mines, or the potential for liquefied natural gas, should Alberta's proposed energy corridor move forward and volumes increase rapidly. Viewed over a 10-year horizon and accounting for growth, the total value of trade redirected through Canadian-controlled infrastructure could range from $700 to $800 billion. The United States would not be excluded entirely. Traditional routes would continue to serve certain markets. However, U.S. ports, rail networks, and logistics firms, having benefited from Canada's dependence for generations, would lose a significant share of that business. More importantly, they would lose leverage in negotiations. Infrastructure shapes long-term behavior. Once supply chains are built around a particular corridor, reversing course becomes both costly and difficult. If Genesis Fertilizers structures its operations around Churchill, it will not revert to the old model simply because political pressure eases. If grain storage systems are established along the northern corridor, farmers will use them because efficiency ultimately determines behavior. Investments made today will set the foundation for trade flows for decades to come. That reality is what gives this shift strategic significance well beyond its immediate economic benefits. Washington has virtually no practical tools to stop this process. Canada is not violating trade agreements, nor is it closing its markets. Instead, the economy is redirecting investment toward its own assets and actively putting them to use. Tariff threats, rather than deterring Canada, have strengthened the rationale for this pivot. Efforts to apply pressure and extract concessions have backfired, accelerating diversification and making it more decisive. Each shipment that moves through Churchill is not only a commercial transaction, but also a reduction in future vulnerability. That said, this path is far from easy. The rail line crosses regions increasingly affected by thawing permafrost, making maintenance both complex and costly. Flooding, subsidence, and landslides remain persistent risks. Modernizing a port built in the 1920s to handle 21st century cargo volumes requires investment measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Icebreaker capacity must also be expanded to extend the shipping season. At the same time, housing and essential services in a community of fewer than 1,000 residents must be upgraded to keep pace with rising activity. After decades of unfulfilled promises, skepticism is understandable. What distinguishes the current moment is the growing convergence of factors. Maritime economics favors shorter routes. Congestion is eroding the